We have a very interesting session ahead. 3 presentations involved in some way or another with language. I'm not going to waste time and saying too much about the papers. You have them in front of you, the abstracts, but I will introduce the speakers. Dr. Ben O'Ciala is a colleague of mine, as it happens, in the Department of Welsh and Celtic Studies in Aberystwyth, and he's interested in language and society, and he will be first. Then Dr. Iaith Jewell, who also, as it happens, a colleague of mine in the Department of Welsh and Celtic Studies in Aberystwyth, and she's interested particularly in language and translation, and she's going to look at that today in the context of law. And then we welcome Dr. Joanna Chojnicka, I hope I said that right, Joanna, from the University of Cardiff. And between us, we have a Babel's Tower of languages, all sorts of different languages from all over Europe. And she's naming them all. But today we are going to be conducting the session in 2 languages, Welsh and English. When Ben starts, he's written a lot about the politics of language, globalization of language, and neoliberalism and language revival. But today he's going to look at the Green New Deal and ask, is there a window of opportunity for minoritized languages? So Ben, I hope you're there and the stage is yours. You have 10 minutes. Welcome. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming.
I'll first talk about language loss and then the Green New Deal, and then I'm going to attempt to try and draw the 2 concepts together. With the best estimate that we have, there are about 7,000 languages spoken in the world today versus, of course, about 200 nation states. But on average, one of these languages dies out every 10 days. Each one, as the classic line goes, the equivalent of a national library being burned down, each a vast repository of knowledge and culture lost forever. Globally, linguistic diversity tends to be located in areas of high ecological diversity. This co-location is sometimes called biocultural diversity. The famous example is Papua New Guinea, which is home to vast tracts of fairly untouched rainforest and has about 800 languages spoken there. It's often observed that linguistic minorities hold so-called traditional ecological knowledge, which allows for the maintenance of ecological diversity in a way that otherwise doesn't happen. But as well as language diversity facing crisis in and of itself, the present ecological catastrophe is also well known to impact minoritized groups more severely, including, of course, linguistic minorities. It's really, to be honest, quite a desperate situation for those interested in linguistic diversity, just as it is for those who care about ecological diversity. Now, the Green New Deal. So this is a contested term which is differently mobilized by various political actors, but essentially it's a proposal for remaking society and the economy in a more sustainable way. A core concept is that of the just transition, so ensuring that decarbonization doesn't plunge huge sections of society into even greater levels of precarity. So instead of worrying about all the jobs that will be lost due to the closure of fossil fuel intensive industries, we should create, the line goes, well-paid employment, doing vital work like retrofitting buildings with insulation or developing better public transport or changing the way food is produced and distributed and so on. The Green New Deal has been critiqued from the left as not going far enough and just saying outright that capitalism itself has to go if we're to have a fighting chance of averting the collapse of civilization. And I don't have time to go into that argument today, unfortunately, but I do want to note that people who have written about this, what is essentially a modest social democratic proposal, often see the Green New Deal as a stepping stone towards something post-capitalist. So Anne Pettifor, for instance, told me herself that that was her hope. I met her by coincidence during an Extinction Rebellion blockade in London of the Bank of England in 2019, and we talked about this. So a key point that's particularly relevant for this talk is that language revitalization is not all about immersion schooling or classes for adults, as important and worthwhile as those things are. Here are some important quotes about what it actually entails. And these are some sort of very highly regarded scholars in the field. So first of all, the great Colin Williams says, political autonomy and economic autarky are the twin preconditions of successful language regeneration. And similar points are made by a whole host of other sort of big names in the field. And there are some representative quotes there on the slide about how it is social policy and community sustainability that's needed really, rather than language policy per se. An example that some of you will be familiar with, of course, is that without addressing the problems in the housing market in Welsh-speaking areas, linguicentric policies can only do so much. There's another important figure, scholar in my field, John Edwards, and he's stated that people involved in language revitalization very frequently want to maintain the socioeconomic status quo, but just change the language that's being spoken. But of course, as he points out, it's usually that very status quo that led to the language being minoritized in the first place. And then Edwards tends to say, well, of course, revolutions can happen, but nobody wants that, right? But in response, I would say that there are enough major crises facing us, and there's enough anti-systemic sentiment bubbling around the world that I think Edwards' dismissal of revolutionary upheaval without any further discussion may be premature, especially as we move into an era of ever worsening ecological collapse. Apologies for this wall of text, but it's important to the argument I'm making, so I want to quote it in full. This is from the well-known author Naomi Klein talking about the Green New Deal. She says, "We need more than a New Deal painted green or a Marshall Plan with solar panels. We need changes of a different quality and character. We need wind and solar power that is distributed and, where possible, community owned, rather than the New Deal's highly centralized, monopolistic, river damming hydro and fossil fuel power. We need beautifully integrated, beautifully designed, racially integrated, zero carbon urban housing, built with democratic input from communities of colour, rather than the sprawling white suburbs and racially segregated urban housing projects of the post-war period. We need to devolve power and resources to indigenous communities, so key point, smaller farmers, ranchers, and sustainable fishing folks, so that they can lead a process of planting billions of trees, rehabilitating wetlands, renewing soil, rather than handing over control of conservation to the military and federal agencies, as was the case with the New Deal's Conservation Corps." So this is obviously quite polemical rhetoric, but I hope you can see the connection between this, power and resources for indigenous communities, and Colin Williams talking about political autonomy and economic autarky as the twin preconditions of language revival. So that then is the crux of my argument right there. On the one hand, we have those in my field talking about the need for redistribution of power and resources, while at the same time there is significant political discourse internationally about the Green New Deal, many understandings of which propose doing basically just that. So maybe the Green New Deal is just what communities in the west of Ireland or Scotland or parts of Wales that I'm familiar with need serendipitously. Wouldn't that be nice? Now, of course, just because Naomi Klein says something doesn't mean that's how the Green New Deal is understood by everyone or that that's what we'll get. But I do think that it's significant that this general idea is being talked about on such a wide scale. And rhetoric like Klein's clearly animates a whole host of social movements across the world. So Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, the school strikers, and so on. So I think it is worth paying attention to. But I also think there are some important lessons that we can learn from the original New Deal in the United States in the 1930s, which redistributed wealth and created employment to a degree which has rarely been achieved before or since, for all its problems and racism and so on. It was still very significant. Primarily, I think we have to remember that President Roosevelt didn't just implement the New Deal in response to the Wall Street crash of 1929 just out of personal moral conviction. He was forced to do so by the trade unions. And quite simply, without mass popular organization, there will be no Green New Deal. So get active in a union or a direct action group if you're not already. But something else which is also, I think, lost and never mentioned really, I've never seen it mentioned in discourse about the Green New Deal, is that the original New Deal resulted in a kind of forgotten attempt at a fascist coup in America, where the CEOs of some of America's biggest corporations like the Rockefeller Foundation, General Motors, DuPont and others tried to copy European fascism and install a military dictator to undo the policies of the New Deal. There was even a congressional hearing about it, and to this day, the names of many of the key players involved in what was known as the business plot or the Wall Street putsch remain classified. I think it's always worth remembering the political usefulness of the far right to economic elites in times of crisis. And although the presence of eco-fascism in the real world has been fairly limited so far, it may well gain traction as the 21st century equivalent of the business plot or in any other number of possible forms if we don't all act to prevent this. But I guess that note of caution aside, what I'm arguing here is overall an optimistic point about how a Green New Deal, which may yet become politically inevitable, could coincidentally have very beneficial consequences for marginalized communities, including linguistic ones. Of course, though none of this is predetermined, there are plenty of paths in front of us that will lead to barbarism unless, as I say, popular struggle acts to close them off. And this, I think, is something I'm sure you'll all appreciate that we all need to be involved in, as the situation is just too grave for us not to be. So for those of us who are interested in linguistic diversity, I propose then going forward with the popular motto of system change, not climate change, but then adding my own addendum of paradigm shift, not language shift. And time will tell how we get on.
So Iaith, you're here now, and you are a colleague of mine, and this is an opportunity for you to say about your interest. You studied Italian and French originally, but now you're interested in translation, not just from French to Italian, but maybe specifically to Welsh and where the languages meet. But you have a topic today which goes a bit further than literary translation, which we normally see in universities, and takes us to the law and this practical effect of having a translator who is an interpreter and is a simultaneous translation.
Yeah. Diolch yn fawr eto.
Thank you once again, Marie. So, although I lecture in Welsh, my academic background is in modern languages, and my research spans these disciplines. Translation studies is a comparatively young area in Welsh and encompasses topics such as literature, linguistics, languages, and language policy. Consideration is given to questions such as, is a translation different from the original? If so, how is it different? And why is that significant? You may be aware that words in one language do not correspond exactly to words in another language. But how often have you considered the effect of the translator's choices, the effect of choosing one word even, especially in a legal context? Consider the difference between possible translations of the word take in Welsh, codi, pick, cymryd, seize or take, or dwyn, steal, in a piece of evidence about a theft, and the influence of this on the jury. Translation studies can teach us a lot about the texts being translated, the work of the translator themselves, the languages and cultures concerned, and the role of the translator in our bilingual society. This brief talk is based on a project investigating a type of translation that includes an additional challenges: simultaneous translation. Simultaneous translation, of course, is happening now, as some of you are listening to a translator who's converting my words into English as I speak. As the name suggests, the simultaneous translator translates simultaneously, listening and translating at the same time. Challenging work, I'm sure you'll agree. This project investigates the effect of simultaneous translation on listeners in courts in Wales. It's an interdisciplinary project between me, working in the area of the Welsh language, Dr. Catrin Fleer-Hughes in law, and Dr. Hannah Binks in psychology. Since the introduction of the Welsh Language Act in 1967, when Welsh became an official language in the courts in Wales, any party has the right to use their language of choice in court, but to enable this, simultaneous translators are needed. The aim of this research is to consider to what extent simultaneous translation ensures equality and consistency in a legal context, and what changes could be introduced to improve it. We ask, what is the effect of simultaneous translation on listeners in court? Do practical, physical, and linguistic factors have an influence? And is the individual being treated fairly if they choose to use simultaneous translation? The project's methodology is different from other studies in the field so far. In January 2020, we organized a mock court case in the form of forum theatre. Professional translators and lawyers were used, with actors taking the part of witnesses, and members of the public formed the jury. The intention of forum theatre is to create an atmosphere that allows participants to express opinions openly and honestly. While watching the court case, everyone in the workshop, translator, jury, lawyers, and actors, can make comments and suggestions. For instance, moving the location of an actor or changing the tone of a performance. The participants, therefore, can discuss and experiment with the experience themselves and see their suggestions being put to work. Several interesting considerations emerged, and I'd like to outline 3 of those today. Firstly, the location of the translator. The concept of an invisible translator is a very common image in translation studies, but the translator is often visible in court. According to translators in the workshop, their location can vary substantially in courtrooms across Wales, and this variety affects their ability to do their work and the jury's response to the translation itself. In 2 courts in Wales, there's a soundproof translating booth. In a booth, the translator is not a physical part of the court and is hidden from the mindset of the participants in the case. In other courts, the translator is in the same room, whispering into a microphone. In the workshop, the translator was firstly placed close to the witness and then behind a screen to try to reflect the translation booth. While the translator was close to the witness, the jury's attention was divided, and the witness herself felt awkward and aware of what she was saying. Once the translator was moved behind the screen, everyone agreed that it was easier to focus, and the jury could pay more attention to the witness's face and gestures while listening to the translation. Ideally, therefore, the translators should be able to work in a booth so that they don't impact the listeners or the witness who is speaking. Secondly, the role of the listeners. Most jurors have very little knowledge and experience of simultaneous translation. And listening to a translation is not simple. You only hear a simultaneous translation once. It's not possible to listen again to something that's not clear or is unfamiliar. Also, the listeners have to go back and forth between the translation and the evidence that's not being translated. Although there is great emphasis on the importance of the simultaneous nature of the translation, there is some delay inevitably, which can cause the voice of the translator and that of the lawyer to overlap. Juries can miss a part of the subsequent question, a key word, or the general flow of the questions, as happened in the workshop. This could create a negative impression of the evidence in translation, as the juries have not been prepared adequately. There is currently no specific training for juries on simultaneous translation, but the need for training is great to ensure understanding of the requirements of listening to a translation. Finally, the translator's voice. Although the translator's role is to voice the words of the individual faithfully in a different language, the voice will be different. One crucial difference is the gender of the speaker. There are no rules for using a translator of the same gender as the original speaker in court cases, and so a female translator could be translating a man's words and vice versa. This matter was raised in the workshop as a male translator translated the words of a female witness. It was suggested that we should listen again to one of the female translators translating the evidence. The change had a substantial impact on a number of the jurors, and the general belief was that creating consistency between gender of the translator and the original speaker was very significant. This inconsistency could have an important impact in cases of violence or abuse, where the gender of the defendant is more significant. Our research suggests that efforts should be made to match speakers with translators of the same gender to ensure a faithful and similar translation. To summarize, I've given you a taste of some of the considerations involved with simultaneous translation in court cases in Wales. The location of the translator, the understanding of the listener of the translation process, and the variations in the translator's voice can all impact the perception of the jury and the individual's court experience. And we haven't even touched on the effect of the words themselves. In providing simultaneous translation, courts in Wales should ensure that more than the individual's right to use their language of choice, they should ensure support for that choice with a system that creates clarity and justice through that translation. Thank you. I hope, Joanna, that you are there. And she is a Marie Curie Fellow at present in the School of Modern Languages in Cardiff University, working on translation and particular interest in gender and attitudes toward the LGBTQ+ society in discourse in the media, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. A very warm welcome to you. You'll have your full 10 minutes, don't worry. Good afternoon, everybody. I am learning Welsh, but I shall speak now in English today.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction and for saying the title of my project in Welsh. I appreciate that. And you can actually see the title of my project on the screen, because what I want to do in this presentation today is to kind of walk you through all the different elements that make up this title, because I think this will really help you understand what the project is about in the end. So the project on the screen is slightly deconstructed, and I'm going to zoom in on each of these elements to explain them in more detail. I will not go in the order of the words. I will start with the most general and finish with the most specific. So we will start with a bit of theory and end with some empirical examples. So I actually want to start with discourses. Discourses are particular ways of talking about things that have developed over time in a specific culture, are based on ideologies and express attitudes. So if we have a look at our gender and sexuality discourses, which are the object of the study, we can, for example, think about the example of homosexuality. So in our European Western culture, we used to talk about homosexual acts rather than people. So we conceptualized homosexuality in terms of acts rather than, you know, personality traits or identities. And so homosexuality did not describe a person. And then the discourse was medicalized under the influence of especially American psychologists. So we started talking about homosexuality as a psychological disorder, and it was included on the list of psychological disorders for a bit. And then we moved on to talking about it as an orientation. And now we tend to think about it as an identity. So we can kind of see the stages of how this discourse has developed over time. And in my project, I want to look at how these gender and sexuality discourses figure in transition narratives on social media. So I use Polish social media, YouTube and blogs. And I consider transition narratives to be a kind of genre. They do share specific features and elements. And it is especially interesting to look at these blogs and vlogs because they offer us a glimpse at this transition as a kind of journey, right? It is a kind of document. These media document the journey of the transitioning individuals from this moment of self-discovery through the agony of deciding whether to transition or not to, for example, documenting the effects of hormone therapy. For example, the voice videos where people record text, so an audio in certain intervals of time to kind of document how their voices change on testosterone, for example. And if this sounds familiar, so maybe you have seen one of those videos, for example, in English on YouTube, you may be wondering, okay, so I know this from English-speaking media, but you said that discourses are culture-specific, so how come we see the same thing in Polish, on Polish social media? And the thing is, discourses have, some of them have more power than others, and discourses actually travel and are mobile, ideas travel, right? And the world today kind of sees the discursive dominance of English-speaking cultures over other cultures. And so, for example, this medicalized discourse of transsexuality, which was kind of, which started in American clinics, has been translated, has been adapted to other cultures. This discourse has been codified in the, for example, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which then has been translated to different languages, including Polish. And many doctors still rely on these manuals, even though the discourse on transsexuality, we would say today transgender, has moved on in English-speaking cultures. And we now talk about, we don't talk about transsexuality as a problem, medical problem anymore. We talk about gender dysphoria being the problem that needs treatment, but not transsexuality, which has become kind of more an identity. But in many places where these texts still prevail, it takes a bit of time before these new modern ways of looking at it take root. So just to give you a glimpse into the Polish context. Poland is obviously, and you are probably aware of that, a terrible place for the transgender community to be living in right now. And in addition to that, it actually lacks gender recognition law and standards of trans-specific medical care, which means that every single transitioning person's case is unique, and it is very much handled on a case-by-case basis by doctors and judges, who still do rely on this oversimplified medical discourse of transsexuality. But I would also claim that it is an oversimplification to say that these discourses have been simply imposed on Poland and Polish transitioning individuals and their doctors are kind of passive victims of these discourses. It does not quite work this way, and that's what I want to show in my project. So the situation in Central and Eastern Europe, which is the post-socialist space, has been described as a knotted temporality, which means that while, as we have seen with this example of homosexuality, while in the West, these discourses had time to gradually develop, in Central and Eastern Europe, they kind of arrived all at once. And this has created a lot of confusion. So those quite, medicalized and rather conservative discourses arrived basically at the same time as the discourse on queer and transgender and so on. So they basically coexist in the same space and kind of compete with each other. So just to give you some examples on the practices that I look at in these transition narratives, I divided them into 3 categories, just for the sake of this presentation. This is an oversimplification, but I want to kind of explain what I'm doing. So I have the categories of translanguaging practices, semantic transfer, and transgressing. Obviously, you see that I'm also playing with the multiplicity of and the productivity of the prefix trans. So translanguaging practices are basically situations where a word is taken over, is borrowed from, in this case, English into Polish, basically both in form and content, simply because the meaning of the word hasn't existed in Polish before. And here we have varying degrees of integration into the Polish grammatical system. So, for example, osoba afab would mean a person assigned female at birth. And we can see that the abbreviation has been taken over without kind of deconstructing it, right? What it means exactly. And it is used as a word that cannot be, so it's indeclinable, it's not integrated into the Polish grammatical system. But the second example, wyautować się, is quite interesting because the English word out, from to come out or to out oneself, has become a verb in Polish and is now fully integrated into the grammatical system, which means that it can receive prefixes, suffixes, and so on. But it is still quite an interesting case because the out stem in this word is actually pronounced as in English and not as it would be pronounced in Polish, because the OU would be pronounced differently in Polish. So it's quite an interesting kind of combination. And semantic transfer means that we have a word that has received a new meaning in the source language, and this new meaning is also being taken over by the target language. So this is my favorite example. It is, of course, a neurologism, and it's very, very funny. So some of my vloggers refer to themselves as a frying pan person, which is a kind of the literal translation of pansexual. So there is the second meaning of pan, meaning a frying pan. There is also the word pansexualny, which is also obviously a borrowing from English, but this one is a jocular one, and it really does illustrate this creativity and how innovative this discourse has become. And the final category, transgressing, I mean, obviously all these practices are transgressive. They are all tweaking both the source language and the target language. But in this category, I include expressions that do not actually come from another language, but are still very interesting for me to look at. And this is, for example, when trans men refer to their internal organs, such as uterus or ovaries, as plumbing, so kanalizacja. Well, it does not exactly mean plumbing, but I wanted to have a nice translation here. Or referring to their periods as Satan's waterfalls. I think that's very creative and very illustrative. Okay, so I do not really have conclusions because I have just started this project, but I would like to show you another. So basically, I would like to just really briefly talk about the objectives of this project. I just need to scroll on. Oops, that's a bit too much. Here, yeah, project objectives. So again, I have kind of 3 categories of project objectives, which are center, shift, and change. So what I mean by center, there is this idea that transgender is to cisgender as what we can kind of compare it to the relationship between multilingualism and monolingualism, because there is this ideology of monolingualism, which basically says or assumes that everyone is monolingual and being monolingual is normal, and by we can extend that to cisgender by saying people are simply the genders that they are assigned, and that is normal. So I want to kind of center these trans perspectives, so transition and translation, as kind of technologies that are used to restore this mono order, but I want to center these abnormal situations, so the transgender and multilingualism, to center them and decenter what we have considered to be normal. When it comes to shift, this project aims to shift, sorry, it's somehow very difficult to navigate, to shift away from the focus of focus on dominance of Western medical discourses, which, as I said, construct transitioning individuals as passive victims of the colonizing power of these discourses. So I want to show how this creative and innovative language, we have seen examples of this, individualize this representation of the transitioning experience and resist these predominant medicalized and pathologizing discourses. And finally, change. So the goal is, of course, to contribute to social change. And yeah, in terms of contributing to the development of a gender recognition law and standards of medical transition in Poland that would reflect these different experiences and that would shift away from these more medicalized and pathologizing discourses. I guess that's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to questions.
Diolch yn fawr iawn I ti, Joanna. Gobeithio bod ti'n ynghlywed I. Yn amlwg mae yna thema heblaw am iaith yn rhedeg trwy'ch papurau chi gyd, sef yr alwad yma am shift, am symud, am newid. Ond mae yna gwestiynau, felly na I droi at Rhynna. Dwi'n meddwl mai bus I fod I ddarllen nhw allan. Cwestiwn Jennifer falle gynta. Mae'n gofyn cwestiwn, a na I ofyn y cwestiynau sy'n dod yn Saesneg, dwi'n meddwl rhag drysu'r peth yn llwyr.
I'm now unmuted, so she's going to ask English questions in English. Was the translator able to carry the emotion of the witness? For example, if the witness giving evidence was tearful and got angry, was the translator able to work that into their translation? Iaith.
It's a very interesting question, and of course, according to the standard procedure for interpreters in court, interpreters are expected to evoke emotion and tone in the way that the original speaker is doing so. To what extent they are actually able to do that completely faithfully is, of course, another question. And this is actually the next aspect that we are hoping to investigate. We would like to conduct another workshop on a larger scale where we're able to assess the impact of the voice of the interpreter and the nature of those changes and the impact of that then on those listening, particularly, for example, if there's quite intense questioning and the defendant or the witness is put under pressure and reacting, as you suggest, Jennifer, in an emotional, agitated manner. How does that then impact the nature of the interpretation that's produced, and how is that relevant then to the court experience?
And maybe as a follow-on from that, Jennifer also noticed on the slides themselves that where the word Chyfieithu was in Welsh, that the translation was impact. Now, I'm not sure how much conversation there's been between yourself and Katrin, who's translating for us today, but would you like to comment on that as well? Well spotted, Jennifer.
It's a very interesting spot, and I obviously wasn't aware of it because I can't hear Katrin. And Katrin had seen my my presentation, but she hadn't seen my slides. So that just shows that exactly there's a subjective element to any interpretation, to any translation, that there are choices to be made, and in a courtroom some of those choices really could be very significant as to the outcome of that court case.
But just to add to that, of course, impact is a perfectly, well, I suppose that would be the word you'd use in this context. We don't really have that word. It's a much falser word in Welsh, traw-effaith or something, whereas effaith is quite ordinary in a way that impact is too in English, I'd say. I don't know.
Yes, I agree completely, Meredith. We see this with when we try to use the word impact in an academic context. Of course, the word doesn't quite translate to Welsh in the same way, and so there is also that inevitable difference between the nature of the languages. And there's nothing wrong with the choice that Catherine made. Of course, I would perhaps have made the choice myself had I been translating from the Welsh with a different context then, and it's a perfectly valid decision. And it's just that any individual interpreter could do something slightly different with what they hear and translate.
So perhaps what we're getting to there is that behind these words there are cultural meanings that are very difficult to convey anyway, and maybe that requires an understanding of the problem, at least, if not of the solution. And maybe this is part of Simon's question, and I think I'm going to bat it to Ben, although it is actually to all three of you, and I'm jolly glad I'm just sharing this here. The question is, it starts like this, and I really don't want this to be taken in the wrong way. I'm reading the question. I am very pro-Welsh language. I'm just curious. Do you think the bilingual nature of Wales is a barrier to inward investment from both the UK and internationally in industry? When I go to international meetings to discuss either research policy or funding, the spoken language is English, as this is generally a shared platform. I think these efforts to enable simultaneous translation may bridge these gaps, and I want to see progress, but are we on the back foot before we begin an industrial negotiation? I've got views on that. I'm sure we all have, but I'll start with Ben.
Yeah, I'm sure we all have indeed. It's a good question. It's sometimes said sort of the vulgar understanding is that capitalism destroys all diversity that it can't profit from. And yeah, there's some degree of truth in that, but also capitalism is perfectly well able to accommodate diversity when there's profit to be made, right? So there's no issue with translating when they want to sell fighter jets to Saudi Arabia, right? They're suddenly able to accommodate that because they want to make money. And if there is an adequate language policy regime which just says, well, you don't have a choice if you want access to this market, and we're accepting all sort of assumptions about the existence of the market continuing as much as it is currently and so on, but if we do accept that, there's no reason why a language policy can't be in place that just says, well, access is contingent on accepting these linguistic conditions. States do it all over the world. Non-state actors do it all over the world. Indeed, businesses themselves do it all over the world. I always think one example that is worthy of attention is Mondragon, the Basque cooperative, which was set up in the 1950s as a language revival effort. It's now the 10th biggest company in the Spanish state, as we might call it. Employs 75,000 people, operates entirely through Basque, has offices all around the world, operates democratically with a sort of a level management structure, more or less, and still manages to compete perfectly well, even within capitalism. So there are examples of how these two things can coexist, even though there is obviously the tension which you've rightly drawn attention to. So it's not like there's no tension there, but I just don't think it's one which is utterly intractable. I guess that's how I'd answer that at the moment.
Diolch yn fawr I ti, Ben. Os rhywun arall yn dymuno neidio mewn.
Would anybody else like to jump in to add to that?
I'd just like to add, I completely agree with you, Ben. There are examples of where this works effectively anyway, and within Wales itself, we are seeing that the use of interpretation is becoming much more commonplace. But since the language standards were introduced, many of us are using interpretation as we are today in the conference, in meetings of all kinds, and I think it's just a matter of improving understanding, of improving an appreciation for how it works, and why it's valuable.
Joanna, I don't know whether you have anything to say on that, but although I'd like to ask you a question.
I actually do. It may be a bit provocative, but I'm just thinking.
Oh, come on, we're all for provocation.
The question is about investments and industrial negotiations, which are elements of capitalism, which we have established, I think, is not working in terms of support for environmental causes and the rights of small languages. So there you go, just abolish capitalism and then everything will be fine.
Simon, would you like to come back on that? I'm looking at the chat best I can if somebody wants to come in. I'll need to ask this question in English because that word trans was so key in your talk, Joanna, and I was thinking to myself, how would you translate that into English? And of course you'd use cyf. Now, Chyfieithu, a cyf and Chyfieithu, the trans in trans language, in trans gender, in translation and so on. But trans comes from this idea of a cross, doesn't it? And the prefix that we have, cyf, it's very difficult to translate actually, but it means certainly it's more about the things that are similar or the things that are brought together. So it's about the link and the similarity, which is actually quite a different concept from the trans thing. It's a bringing together rather than a crossing over. And it's these kinds of little differences that I think makes the whole diversification of language so rich, first of all, but also so worthwhile and important. Because of course we can say translation for Chyfieithu and Chyfieithu for translations, but it's not actually the same idea. There is a different idea behind it. And in there is a wealth that we are in danger of losing. And I think we have been persuaded by a monolingual mindset that it's not about that speaking more than one language is actually just a case of having two sets of words for the same sets of things, but the things themselves are different. That's, I don't know whether...
That's amazing. Actually, thank you very much. I will definitely look into that. I have also done some reading on languages that do not have this trans prefix, and it's really, really fascinating. But you know, there is this argument that relying on English kind of affects negatively the target languages. So, for example, Polish in my case. But the point is that these languages simply do not. They lack the concepts that people need to talk about their experiences in a meaningful way. So they do need to look outside, and they do need to look for these creative ways of describing what they are going through, because otherwise they would simply not get their messages across. So, you know, there's also this idea that languages are simply not, they do not have the same tools to talk about different concepts. And the more languages you speak, the more tools you have to describe those experiences and, you know, to be even able to think about them in a meaningful way.
And it's at that point, isn't it, where the language is lacking and the experience is new and the experience demands language, that language changes, and then we get new words or new ways of expressing. And I think those boundaries are really interesting, but it's not about ditching this whole language, it's about adding, changing, adapting. And there is a danger that people think, oh, that language won't do for that. It's not true. Oh gosh, I think there's a very big question coming. I think this is a question for my glasses. Hold on. Right, Simon's come back to thank you for your responses. And he says this: I guess given the parameters that we live in with modern capitalist society, when we are competing with others, my feeling is that although in an ideal situation we would convince the providers of inwards investment to Wales to put headsets on, I have seen firsthand that folks from Germany, France, US and elsewhere shrug their shoulders and walk away with multi-million-pound projects that could ultimately benefit society, for example, medicine. Well, we may have a challenge, but I'm sure it's not insurmountable. We need to change attitudes, I believe, is what this panel would say. But I will let the panelists answer. Rhiannydd, hoffet ti ddod yn ôl I mewn gyda ryw anogaeth at hwnna?
I suppose that something we have to remember is that in Wales, we are a bilingual society, and this is not just a matter of encouraging the use of our national language, but we do actually have both. And so I would say that when I'm not an expert in international negotiations, I certainly don't claim to be, but we do have both options to hand. And so, you know, it is a matter of seeing the benefits of understanding the use of interpretation for the support of the one language, and remembering that we do have other cards to play.
Diddorol iawn, a I fod yn deg efo Simon i gael ei ateb yn llawn.
And to be fair with Simon, he comes back and he says, it's sad and I agree we need to change attitudes. And I think that that's been a word that's come through from all three of you. And maybe to end, we can pause with this idea of change. The three of you have called for action, in fact. You, Iaith, want to see that the law is implemented in a way that is more equitable and gives more fair play. You, Ben, have asked for action through the paradigm shift, to use your term, and you also, in those last three bubbles on your slide, Joanna, the one in the center that said shift, I assume that you, although you hadn't reached your conclusions, that you foresee that there will be need to be a change. Can I ask you three, and Martin has just given us an extra 5 minutes because we had quite an adventure in the middle of our conversations. How hopeful are you that we will see these changes and that we'll see them soon? Shall I ask that? So we'll start maybe with you, Joanna, and then go to Iaith, and we'll finish with Ben.
When it comes to the situation of the transgender community in Poland, or LGBTQ+ community in Poland in general, I am quite pessimistic at the moment because we are actually seeing a worsening of their situation, and it has been a very kind of consistent race to the bottom, which now Poland has won this race, and it has become the worst place in the EU officially to for a LGBTQ+ person to live in. And the government is just constantly coming up with new ideas how to make life more difficult for also women and members of this community. So I do not. I tend to be pessimistic. I would like to see these changes introduced as soon as possible. But the current conditions are really not favorable. I do hope that this changes, with the next elections, or maybe we bring about some sort of revolution and abolish the. I should not say that because we are being recorded. Currently the situation is quite bad, and
so you're not very optimistic about the change.
So the discourses seem to be changing quicker than legal solutions, medical solutions, and everything that is kind of codified by law and by official kind of approaches. And so we do have the conversation, we do have the queer community, we have all the social change happening, especially among young people, but we do not really see that reflected in law and in medical solutions being offered.
Thank you for that. Ben, I can see you've typed something, but you are willing, you are going to be allowed to speak as well, so I assume you'll summarise that. Iaith, Tiffennar, sut wyt ti'n gweld pethau ti'n gweld?
Iaith, how do you see things? Do you foresee change? Yes, I'm very optimistic about the situation in courts, because the response of the tribunal service and the professional translators has been very enthusiastic, and the hope is that we will see a potential to improve as the service is present for translators themselves and those who are in court, and it's a matter of researching further to see what can be done to improve as the process goes on. And it's excellent, of course, to see research in a college having an impact in court. Ben, what do you have to say?
Well, the comment I wrote in the chat is not so much about Open's one, but it does mention that, as Brianna said, bilingualism is a thing, and there's no reason we can't use separate languages in separate situations. And indeed, the most prominent advocate or most famous scholar in language revitalization, Joshua Fishman, that was the core of his proposal, that we would use separate languages in separate social situations. So one language when you're, living your day-to-day life, and one when you're negotiating with, I don't know, Pfizer or whoever holds the chips at the moment. So that's one thing. In regards to how hopeful I am, well, I always quote, what was his name, Gramsci, about that issue when he said pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. So we can look at things objectively and say, yeah, they're pretty bad, right? We all know that, but we can also use our agency as a class, as individuals to change society. And I always think, when I look at like the disastrous projections of the IPCC and so on, and how catastrophic things really are, I suppose one thing that's difficult for scientists of any description to account for when they do models like this is human agency. And I suppose we can see different pathways in which we could do nothing and things continue to get worse, or in which people sort of take decisive action and at least work to limit the damage which we're facing. So as I say though, nothing good will happen without class organization. I think that's the key, like why we need to be active in our unions, why we need to be agitating for things to change. And I think we have that role as academics as much as we do as, you know, regular people in our private lives, because as I said earlier on, the situation is really too urgent for us not to be involved in these struggles. And I think we can all contribute something of value to those efforts as we hear here today.
Thank you very much to the three of you. You, Dr. Ben Bilingual, and Iaith Joel, and Joanna Chojnicka. We've had a very lively discussion. I am going to hold on to the hope that hope is an action after all. And as we are involved with language in this panel, we can also claim that interdisciplinary core element that language belongs to everyone. And through language, we can change our way of thinking. From the small words that we use are very important. So I'd like to thank you all. Thank you for your patience through the trouble we had. And thank you, of course, to the translator. You're very welcome.